The hatchling screamed, and every nurse on the ward took a step back. Petra Vasquez did not take a step back. She had not taken a step back from anything in 31 years of living, and she was not about to start now because of a creature the size of a golden retriever that happened to breathe fire. She pulled the heat-resistant glove tighter on her left hand, picked up the titanium feeding tongue, and walked toward the enclosure. "Vasquez," said Senior Attendant Moralic from the doorway, his throat sac flushing pale with what she had learned to recognize as anxiety. "The third clutch has not accepted feeding from any attendant in 9 rotations. The Emperor has been notified. I strongly recommend you." "Which one is the loudest?" she asked. Silence from the doorway. She turned and looked at him. Moralic was 8 feet tall, gray-scaled, and had 3 centuries of xenobiological medical training behind him. He was also, at this particular moment, standing in the doorway with his secondary eyelids drawn halfway across his eyes, the Veth equivalent of covering your face with your hands. "The center one," he said finally. But Vasquez, the center one, nearly took off Senior Handler Goreth's entire secondary limb cluster. "Goreth has been in reconstruction surgery for. Which tray has the crowclaw eggs?" Another pause. Then a sound she had come to think of as a sigh, though Veth did not sigh the way humans did. It was more like the slow depressurization of a room. "Third shelf, left side. Great." She turned back to the enclosure. "Close the door behind you." She heard him leave. She did not hear the door close. She stood at the edge of the observation rail and looked at the 3 hatchlings, the third clutch of Emperor, Varesh Salan, who was also the sovereign of 12 systems, the undying flame of the Veth Dominion, and right now, the very stressed parent of 3 creatures who had not eaten in 9 days, and were therefore, by her rough calculation, about 48 hours from organ failure. The enclosure was roughly the size of a tennis court, built of heat-resistant polymer and reinforced xenite, with temperature controls set to 400 degrees on the lower levels and dropping to a livable 250 at the observation rail where Petra stood. She could feel it on her face even from here, a dry, cooking heat, like standing too close to a forge. Her hair was pulled back, her uniform sleeves rolled to the elbows, the heat-resistant glove on her left hand, and a standard-issue Medfield patch on her right wrist, in case she needed to administer emergency sedation. She had been assigned to the Emperor's nursery ward 17 days ago, transferred from the General Intensive Care Unit at the Veth Central Medical Facility on Solon Prime, which was itself a transfer from the Human Medical Liaison Post on the border station at Kepler 7. Her personnel file listed her specialty as neonatal and pediatric critical care, which was the reason the Dominion Medical Authority had flagged her for the assignment. The note attached to the transfer order had said only, "The Imperial hatchlings require a specialist perspective. Standard approaches have been exhausted." She had asked her supervisor, Dr. Yellis, a Veth physician who had 3 sets of arms and the perpetual expression of someone who had just smelled something unpleasant, what that meant exactly. Dr. Yellis had looked at her for a very long time without speaking, which she had also learned was a Veth indicator of emotional difficulty. "It means," Dr. Yellis had said at last, "that every senior attendant in the Dominion Medical Corps has attempted to care for the third clutch. It means that the hatchlings have refused feeding, refused contact, and in several cases refused to allow their caretakers to leave the enclosure without injury. It means that we are out of ideas." A pause. "It means that someone suggested trying a human nurse, and no one could think of a reason not to." That had been 17 days ago. She had spent the first 5 of them reading everything the Veth had documented about Imperial hatchling biology, which was considerable. The Veth were meticulous record keepers, and the Imperial bloodline had been medically documented for 400 years. She had spent 3 more days in the observation gallery, doing nothing but watching the hatchlings through the heat-shielded glass. And then she had asked for access to the enclosure. Moralic had nearly passed out. Now she stood at the observation rail and looked at the 3 creatures below her, and she thought, "They're scared." It was not a complex thought. It was not a medical diagnosis or a xenobiological assessment. It was just the thing she saw when she watched them. 3 hatchlings with nobody. They trusted in a hot box. And every time something large approached them, they screamed and burned and bit, because that was what scared things did. The Veth Medical Corps had interpreted the aggression as a developmental abnormality, possibly neurological. They had written papers about it. They had proposed surgical interventions. Petra had read those papers in her bunk at night and thought, "These people have never spent 6 hours in a NICU." She walked along the rail to the temperature gradient ramp, a sloping passage that descended into the enclosure designed for the use of heat-armored handlers. The armor hung on a rack beside the ramp entrance, a full suit of it, interlocking plates of xenite and heat polymer designed for a Veth body, which meant it was roughly 8 feet tall and had provision for multiple limb clusters. It would not fit her in any useful way. She did not picked up the tray of crowclaw eggs from the third shelf, 7 of them, each about the size of her fist, dark red-brown and rough-surfaced, carrying the specific protein-fat ratio that the hatchlings required. She tucked the tray under her arm, picked up the feeding tong in her gloved left hand and walked down the ramp. The heat hit her like a wall at 270 degrees. She kept walking. Her face felt like she was leaning into an open oven. Her eyes watered immediately from the dry air. She blinked the water away and kept walking. The 3 hatchlings were clustered at the far end of the enclosure, the way they always were when a handler entered, pressed together in a pile. The largest one, designation 3 Alpha, positioned at the front of the group with his neck up and his throat sac already glowing orange with warning heat. He was roughly 60 centimeters from snout to tail tip, which was small for a Veth hatchling but not abnormally so. His scales were a deep amber that would deepen to the imperial copper as he aged. His eyes were the color of molten gold, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that would have been unsettling in a creature 10 times his size. She sat down on the floor of the enclosure. The ceramic tile was hot even through her uniform. She set the tray of eggs on the tile in front of her, put down the feeding tong, took off the heat-resistant glove, and folded her hands in her lap. 3 Alpha's glow intensified. She did not move. The hatchlings made a sound she could only describe as crackling, a rapid, dry vocalization that the documentation called a threat display. The middle one, 3 Beta, smaller, with a slight lateral curvature of the spine that she was monitoring, pressed closer to 3 Alpha's flank. The smallest 3 Gamma had her eyes fixed not on Petra but on the eggs. Petra noticed that. She picked up 1 egg with her bare right hand. The heat of the enclosure meant the egg was warm, not uncomfortably so, for an egg. It sat in her palm, rough-surfaced and dense, and she held it out at arm's length. Not toward 3 Alpha, but toward 3 Gamma, who was small and hungry and not screaming at her yet. Silence. 3 Gamma's gaze moved from the egg to Petra's face and back to the egg. A very long moment passed. Then the smallest hatchling took 3 small, scrabbling steps forward. 3 Alpha made a sound like a gas burner igniting. Petra did not look at 3 Alpha. She kept her eyes on 3 Gamma, kept her arm extended, kept her face as still and neutral as she could manage, which took some effort because the ambient temperature was now causing actual pain along her forearm, and she was starting to wonder if she had overestimated her own heat tolerance. 3 Gamma came close enough to sniff the egg. A hatchling sniff was not subtle. It involved the whole front of the face, a rapid flickering of the scent slits on either side of the snout, accompanied by a small hot exhalation that hit Petra's hand like a brief burst from a heat gun. She kept her hand steady. 3 Gamma sniffed the egg 3 times, then very carefully took it from her palm with a pair of small, precise 4-claw grips. The egg disappeared in 2 bites. The hatchling looked at Petra. Petra reached into the tray and held out another egg. Behind 3 Gamma, 3 Alpha had gone very still. She fed 3 Gamma 3 eggs in a row, slowly, one at a time, making no sudden movements, keeping her body low and her arms below the level of 3 Alpha's eyeline. Then she set the remaining 4 eggs on the tile and did not pick any of them up. 3 Beta moved first, a slow, sideways creep around 3 Alpha's bulk, eyes fixed on the eggs. Petra let her take one from the tray without interference, then another. 3 Beta ate both with the rapid, gulping efficiency of a creature that had been hungry for too long, and Petra felt something in her chest settle slightly, the specific loosening that came from watching a sick thing eat. 3 Alpha had not moved and had not looked away from her face. She met his gaze. She had read enough Veth behavioral documentation to know that direct eye contact with an Imperial hatchling during a threat display was, by every measure they had, a catastrophically bad idea. She held it anyway, because the eyes looking at her were not the eyes of a creature preparing to attack. They were the eyes of a creature trying to figure out what she was. She had seen that look before. In the NICU at St. Agatha's on Earth, in the pediatric ward at Port Halcyon on Kepler 4, in every room she had ever walked into carrying food for something small and frightened that had been handled by too many strangers for too many days. She had learned slowly and imperfectly what that look needed in response. She reached into the tray and held out the last egg, not toward 3 Alpha, not extended forward in the offering posture she'd used for the others. Just resting on her palm, hand open, elbow on her knee, at rest. Take it if you want, don't if you don't. Either way, I'm still sitting here. 3 Alpha looked at the egg for a very long time. His throat sac glow faded from orange to a dim amber. His neck lowered, incrementally, until his snout was at the level of his shoulder joints, which was, according to the documentation, a posture associated with neutral to curious behavioral states. He crossed the enclosure floor in 3 long, fluid strides and took the egg from her hand so precisely that she didn't even feel his claws. She heard the observation gallery erupt above her, a collective sound from the team of Veth observers that she would later be told was the closest Veth vocal anatomy could come to a gasp. She didn't look up. She kept her eyes on 3 Alpha, who had moved to a position approximately 1 meter from her left knee and was eating with his back to her, which she was fairly certain was a significant thing, and filed it away. She sat in the enclosure for another 40 minutes after the eggs were gone, until 3 Beta fell asleep against her right leg, and 3 Gamma had climbed onto the tray and was using it as a bed. She ran her bare hand along 3 Beta's spine once carefully and assessed the curvature with her fingers. Worse than she'd hoped, better than she'd feared, treatable with consistent physical therapy and proper nutrition. She made a note of it in her head. When she finally stood up and walked back up the ramp, the heat gradient fell away like stepping out of a furnace, and the cooler air of the observation level felt so shockingly good that she stood in it for a moment with her eyes closed. Moralic was waiting for her. He had not, she noticed, closed the door. "You should have died," he said. His voice held a specific quality that she could not immediately classify. It was not anger, it was not awe exactly. It was something in between that the Veth apparently did not have a human word for. "I didn't," she said. "The ambient temperature at enclosure floor level exceeds the biological survival threshold for unarmored humans by a margin of. I was fine." She picked up the heat-resistant glove from where she'd left it at the top of the ramp and tucked it under her arm. 3 Beta has a spinal curvature. I'd like to start a physical therapy protocol. And they need more frequent small portion feeding rather than the twice-daily standard schedule. 9 days without food, they must have been terrified. Moralic stared at her. All 6 of his eyes, which could move independently and therefore covered a remarkable range of simultaneous focal points, were pointed at her face, which was the Veth equivalent of staring with unusual intensity. "What?" she said. "No one has ever sat on the floor of the enclosure," he said. "Well," she said, "someone should have." She wrote her report that evening in her quarters, a small, temperature-regulated room on the medical station's residential level, with a viewport that looked out over the Solon system's orbital ring and a cot that was slightly too short for her. The report was detailed and clinical. Feeding behavior, feeding response, postural indicators, estimated nutritional deficit, spinal assessment for 3 Beta, behavioral notes on 3 Alpha's transition from threat display to neutral curious posture. She sent it to Dr. Yellis and Moralic and the Imperial Nursery Board simultaneously, which she had been told was irregular, but which she had decided was more efficient than sending it to one person and waiting for it to be forwarded. The response from the Imperial Nursery Board came back in 40 minutes. It said, "Your methodology is noted and appreciated. Please continue your current approach. We will inform His Radiance of the progress." She read that twice. Then she turned off her viewport, lay down on the short cot and stared at the ceiling, and let herself feel for just a moment how hot her arm still was from the enclosure. His Radiance, Emperor Varish Salan, the ruler of 12 star systems, whose empire had integrated humanity into its fringes 14 years ago. Not conquered, not exactly, though the distinction had required considerable diplomatic creativity, whose government employed Petra Vasquez and 40,000 other humans in various medical and technical and administrative capacities, and whose 3 children had just eaten from her hand. She thought about 3 Gamma's careful, precise claw grip, the way she'd approach sideways with one eye on Petra and one on the egg, reading both simultaneously. Smart, she thought, all 3 of them. Not neurologically abnormal, just smart enough to know something was wrong. She fell asleep thinking about the spinal curvature, running through physical therapy protocols in her head, and did not dream of anything at all. The next morning, she came back and sat on the floor of the enclosure again. This time she brought a soft percussion instrument, a small hand drum she had requisitioned from the station's recreation allocation, which had resulted in a conversation with the quartermaster that she did not particularly want to repeat. The drum was roughly the size of a dinner plate and made of polymer-stretched membrane over a hollow composite frame. She had tested it in her room the night before and determined that the fundamental frequency fell within the Veth hatchling auditory range, skewing toward the lower register that the documentations associated with thermal comfort vocalizations made by adult Veth. She sat down on the floor and put the drum in her lap and waited. 3 Alpha came to the center of the enclosure within 4 minutes, which was already an improvement over the previous day's 12. He sat at a distance of approximately 2 meters and watched her with his throat sac, dark, no threat coloring at all, and his neck at medium height. She tapped the drum once with her bare palm, a low, soft resonance. She watched 3 Alpha's scent slits flutter. She tapped it again and again. A slow, even rhythm, not quite a heartbeat, slower than that, closer to the resting respiration rate she had calculated for the hatchlings based on their size and thermal requirements. She had spent an hour the previous evening looking up Veth hatchling comfort rhythms and had found almost no documentation, which meant she was working from first principles and reasonable extrapolation, which was honestly most of her career. 3 Alpha took one step forward. She kept playing. He came the rest of the way in stages, over the next hour. 2 steps, pause, 3 steps, pause. A long, motionless stretch where she thought he'd decided against it, and then a sudden close approach that brought him within half a meter, close enough that she could see the individual scale patterns on his snout and the extraordinary golden detail of his irises. She kept the rhythm steady and did not look directly at him, watching him instead in her peripheral vision the way she'd learned to watch frightened children in the NICU, present but not intense, available but not demanding. He sat down less than an arm's length away. She kept playing. He put his head down on his forelimbs. Not sleep. She could see from his breathing that he was fully awake and alert. But a resting posture, a choosing to stay posture. Behind him, 3 Beta and 3 Gamma were already wrestling over the second egg tray, which Moralic had lowered on a mechanical arm at her instruction. She could hear the small crunch and swallow sounds that meant they were eating. She let herself notice that without showing it, which was a thing she had spent 31 years learning. She sat in the enclosure for 3 hours that morning. When she left, 3 Alpha followed her to the base of the ramp and stood there watching her walk up it, which Moralic, observing through the gallery window, told her afterward had caused 2 junior attendants to physically grab each other. In alarm, because no Imperial hatchling had ever followed a handler voluntarily in the entire documented history of the Dominion's nursery records. They're not aggressive, she told him. They've been handled wrong. Moralic's throat sac went through a series of color transitions she couldn't. Entirely red. The senior handlers of the Imperial Nursery Corps have training protocols spanning. I know, I read them. They're excellent protocols for creatures that respond to authority and size hierarchies. Imperial hatchlings don't. She handed him her morning report. 3 Alpha shows clear signs of preferential bonding behavior. He's been waiting for someone to respond to his social signaling correctly. All 3 of them have. They're not damaged. They needed someone to sit down. Moralic looked at her report. He read it with the focused, slightly pained expression of someone encountering information that reorganized something they thought they understood. Then he said, very quietly, "How did you know to sit down?" She thought about that for a moment. About every room she had ever walked into carrying food for something small and frightened. About the fundamental principles she had been taught in her first year of nursing, which she had been told was too simple to be worth writing down, and which she had therefore spent her entire career quietly believing was the only thing that really mattered. "I didn't know," she said. "I just thought, if I were in a hot box and I was scared and everyone who came in was bigger than me and standing up, what would I want?" Moralic was quiet for a long time. Then he did the depressurization thing that she thought of as a sigh. "You wanted them to think you weren't a threat. I wanted them to know I wasn't." She woke the next morning to a message from Dr. Yellis, which contained only 2 lines. "Your methods are drawing significant attention from the Imperial household. Please be advised that His Radiance has requested a status briefing on the 3rd clutch at the end of the standard rotation. Please also be advised that His Radiance has been known to personally attend the briefings he requests." She read this, put down her coffee, a human luxury that the Veth had included in the station's commissary, because somebody somewhere in the diplomatic apparatus had thought that was worth doing, and she had been grateful for it every single morning for 17 days, and went back to reading her physical therapy notes for 3 Beta's spine. If the Emperor was going to attend a briefing, she was going to have something worth briefing about. She had been reading, in the evenings, everything she could find about Veth Imperial biology that wasn't in the standard medical files. Not the clinical documentation, but the older records, historical accounts, archival transcriptions, even some translated fragments of Veth oral tradition that had been preserved in the cultural database the Dominion had opened to human scholars as part of the integration accords. She had been looking for one specific thing: descriptions of how Veth adults interacted with hatchlings in the wild before the Dominion had centralized Imperial breeding and care into formal nursery facilities. She had found it in a fragment of translated text attributed to a Veth archivist from 3 centuries back, describing a practice that had apparently been standard before institutionalization. The first handler of an imperial hatchling would imprint a thermal signature, a specific warmth pattern generated by their own body heat, that the hatchling would recognize and associate with safety for the rest of its life. The nursery protocols had replaced this with standardized thermal-controlled enclosures and heat-armored handlers. She had thought about this for 2 days before she sat on the floor of the enclosure without her glove. She wrote up the thermal imprinting hypothesis in a separate report and sent it to Dr. Yellis the morning of the Emperor's briefing, along with her standard daily notes. Then she went to the enclosure and spent 2 hours with the hatchlings, during which 3 Alpha allowed her to run her bare hands along his dorsal ridge, assessing scale development, though she was also, she admitted to herself, simply enjoying the extraordinary sensation of those warm, precise scales under her fingers, which was not in any clinical documentation she had read, but which she decided was nevertheless professionally relevant. The Emperor arrived for the briefing at the 14th hour of the rotation. She had expected someone large. The Veth were large as a species. 8 feet was not unusual, and imperial lineage tended to produce individuals at the upper end of that scale. She had expected someone whose presence communicated authority the way Senior Attendant Moralix did, like a wall that happened to be standing upright. What she had not expected was the stillness. Varesh Salan was 10 feet tall and moved like something that knew exactly how much space it occupied and had decided to occupy it deliberately. His scales were the deep copper amber of a mature imperial, heavily patterned across the dorsal ridge and fading to pale gold at the throat. He moved through the observation gallery with a small entourage of officials and attendants, and the officials moved at precisely the pace he set, and the attendants moved in the vectors he implied, and none of it was obviously orchestrated. It was just the natural physics of someone that things organized themselves around. He stopped at the observation window above the enclosure. His 3 children were visible below. 3 Alpha sleeping in the corner with his chin on the warm ceramic floor, 3 Beta engaged in the physical therapy exercises Petra had developed for her spinal condition. A series of lateral flexion stretches designed to look like a game, which 3 Beta had understood on the first day and played with focused intensity, and 3 Gamma industriously dismantling one of the enrichment objects the medical staff had placed at Petra's suggestion. Varesh Salan watched them for a full minute without speaking. Then he said something in Veth that the translator in Petra's earpiece rendered as, "They are well." It was not a question, but it had a question's weight. She stepped forward from the row of medical staff. "They've been eating consistently for 11 days, she said. 3 Alpha has gained approximately 15% body mass since I began the new protocol. 3 Gamma's growth indicators are within normal range. 3 Beta's spinal condition is responding to the physical therapy program." She paused. "They're not just well, they're thriving." The Emperor turned and looked at her. She had the same experience she'd had with 3 Alpha in the first moments, the feeling of being evaluated with complete and unhurried attention by something capable of understanding exactly what it was looking at. "You are the human nurse," he said. "Petra Vasquez, yes. You sat on the floor of the enclosure without armor." His translator gave the words the same even, controlled cadence he had used for everything, but something in the choice of them suggested he had been thinking about this for some time. "The armor wouldn't have fit me correctly," she said, "and I didn't think I needed it. The senior handlers of my nursery corps believed you were attempting suicide. The senior handlers of your nursery corps were working from the assumption that the hatchlings were unstable. I thought they were scared." She paused. I turned out to be right. A very long silence around her. She was aware of the officials and attendants being very still and very carefully, not reacting to the fact that a human medical officer had just told the Emperor of the Veth Dominion that she had been right about his children. "Tell me," Varesh Salan said, "what you saw when you first looked at them." She thought about how to answer this. Not the answer that was medically accurate, though that answer was also true, the one underneath it. "I saw 3 creatures who were frightened," she said. "They had been in an unfamiliar place surrounded by unfamiliar beings who kept trying to impose care on them from above. They couldn't tell the difference between a threat and a caretaker, because everyone who approached them was armored and large and standing, and from their position on the floor, that all looks the same." She looked at the observation window, at 3 Alpha's sleeping shape, at 3 Beta carefully executing a lateral stretch, at 3 Gamma pulling apart a polymer block with focused determination. "I came down to their level. I brought food and I sat still and I let them decide the pace. That's all." "That is not all," the Emperor said. "It was not a correction. It was something else. A recognition," she thought. of the thing underneath the description, the thing that was harder to put into words. She looked up at him, and he was looking at the window, not at her, watching his children. And for a moment, the 10-foot copper-scaled sovereign of 12-star systems was just someone watching his kids through a window, and the expression on his face was not anything she needed a xenobiological training to read. "They're going to be fine," she said quietly. "All three of them." He looked at her again. "I know," he said. And then, in a voice that she thought was not really meant for the officials or the attendants or the medical staff, but for the three creatures visible through the window, "I know." She was given a larger room after that. Not a great deal larger. She was still human medical personnel, not a senior official. And the station's residential hierarchy was what it was, but it had a viewport with a better angle on the orbital ring and a cot that was 3 centimeters longer, which mattered more than she had expected. She was also given unrestricted access to the enclosure, which had previously required 2 hours of paperwork per visit, and was given a permanent notation in her personnel file that read in Veth, something that translated roughly as "Recognized Nursery Specialist, Unconventional Methodology Approved." She read that notation twice, alone in her new room, and laughed once quietly in the dark. The work continued. 3 Beta's spine required more than she had hoped. The curvature was responding to the therapy, but slowly, and Petra found herself researching Veth juvenile skeletal development in the evenings, with the specific obsessive focus that particular medical problems brought out in her. Not distress, exactly, but the kind of concentrated attention that felt like a slight hum behind everything else she was doing. 3 Beta had picked up on it. She watched Petra with an alertness during the therapy sessions that 3 Alpha and 3 Gamma didn't show, as if she understood that something in these exercises was for her specifically, and she gave them the same fierce concentration that she gave everything. Petra liked 3 Beta for that. She liked all 3 of them, but she liked 3 Beta specifically for the way she took on difficult things. 3 Alpha was the first to do something that none of the nursing reports could adequately capture. It happened on the 22nd day, when Petra arrived at the enclosure and sat down in her usual spot on the floor, and 3 Alpha came and sat beside her. Not at a meter, not at half a meter, but pressed against her left leg, his dorsal ridge warm through her uniform, his breathing slow and even. He stayed there for the entire visit. When she stood to leave, he raised his head and watched her go, and then lowered it again. And she walked up the ramp with the specific awareness she always had in those moments of carrying something she couldn't put down. She wrote it in the report as increased proximity tolerance and volitional physical contact, positive bonding indicator. She thought about it for the rest of the day. Moralic found her in the commissary that evening, eating dinner alone over a stack of behavioral notes. He sat down across from her, which was unusual. The Veth generally ate in designated cohort groups, and a senior attendant sitting down to eat with human medical personnel was the kind of thing that made junior attendants nearby go very still and try to look busy. "How is your meal?" he said, in the careful way he had of making social overtures sound slightly like medical assessments. "Fine," she said. "Coffee's still the best thing on the station. How are you?" "I have been reviewing your thermal imprinting hypothesis," he said, ignoring the reciprocal question in the way the Veth often did when they were working towards something. "The archival documentation you cited is significant. I had not encountered it. I found it in the cultural database." "The cultural database is not typically consulted for medical protocols." "No," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "You read the cultural records, you sat on the floor without armor, you played a percussion instrument." He paused. "At what point did you become confident that your approach would succeed?" She put down her fork. She looked at the viewport, the orbital ring, a pale arc of light against the station's night cycle, the stars beyond it scattered and distant and indifferent. "I wasn't confident," she said. "I thought it was worth trying. But you walked into the enclosure without armor. I thought the risk of them harming me was lower than the documentation suggested, based on what I'd observed from the gallery." She picked her fork back up. "I've been wrong before, but the documentation was based on everyone approaching them as though they were dangerous. I thought, what if we approach them as though they're scared instead? And if I was wrong, I'd find out quickly, and we'd try something else." Moralic's throat sac went through a long, complex series of color transitions. She had been getting better at reading these, though she was aware she probably only understood a fraction of what they communicated. "In 340 years of documented imperial hatchling nursing," he said, "you are the first individual to successfully establish voluntary contact with all 3 members of a clutch within 30 days. She looked at him. "You should have tried sitting down a long time ago." We did not know to try, he said simply. And then, after a pause, we do not know what we do not know. It was, she thought, the most honest thing she had ever heard Veth say. She went back to the enclosure the next morning, and 3 Alpha was waiting at the base of the ramp. Not waiting in the threat posture. Not waiting in the neutral curious posture. Waiting in the posture she had come to think of as, "You took too long, but I'm not going to tell you." His head was tilted slightly to the right, which she had started to recognize as an individual quirk. He tilted his head when he was assessing something he found interesting, and it was becoming one of her favorite things she'd ever seen. She sat down beside him at the base of the ramp without going further into the enclosure, and he pressed against her side and she ran her hand along his dorsal ridge, and behind them at the far end of the enclosure, 3 Beta was already doing her stretches, and 3 Gamma was already systematically destroying today's enrichment object. And Petra looked at all 3 of them and thought, they're going to be fine. I told them they were going to be fine, and they are. She stayed until the rotation's end. The briefing request from the Emperor came the following morning, along with a separate note from the Imperial household that was addressed to her personally. She read it once, put it down, drank her coffee, read it again. The note said that His Radiance wished to observe a nursing session directly, not from the gallery in the enclosure. She thought about this for 1 full minute. Then she sent back an acknowledgement and requested that the Emperor arrive without armor. The response from the Imperial household came back in 3 minutes. It said, "His Radiance has reviewed your request and will comply." She spent the rest of the morning wondering who in the Imperial household had delivered that message to the Emperor of the Veth Dominion and how they had phrased it, and whether they were currently alive. Varesh Salan arrived at the enclosure an hour before the standard feeding time, without the officials, without most of the attendants, and without armor. He wore the draped formal garments that the Emperor customarily used for informal court appearances, which on a 10-foot copper-scaled imperial meant something that looked simultaneously ceremonial and entirely practical, not the elaborate, full court regalia she'd seen in documentary images, but not casual either. He moved down the temperature gradient ramp with the same deliberate stillness she'd noticed in the gallery, and the heat of the enclosure settled around him in a way that looked almost like relief, the way warm water looks when something that belongs in it finally submerges. Veth were warm-blooded in the direction of heat, not cold. 400 degrees felt like a pleasant afternoon. She was already sitting on the floor when he reached the enclosure level. She had the drum in her lap. 3 Alpha was in his usual position at her left leg, pressed close, his eyes on the Emperor. Not threatening, not the orange threat glow she'd seen on day 1. Something more careful than that, watching. Varesh Salan stopped at a distance of 4 meters and looked at his son looking at him. Petra kept her hands still on the drum. She did not speak. This was not, she felt, the moment for a nursing briefing. 3 Beta and 3 Gamma had moved to the center of the enclosure, between Petra and the Emperor, in the clustering posture that in the early days had always meant fear. But their throat sacs were dark, and their posture wasn't pressed small the way it was when they were afraid. They were looking at Varesh Salan the way 3 Alpha was looking, with the same tilted head, careful attention. The Emperor sat down on the floor. It was, Petra thought, probably the first time in 400 years of documented imperial history that a reigning Emperor of the Veth Dominion had sat on the floor of a nursery enclosure. She made a mental note to check. She did not in the moment allow herself to react to it. 3 Gamma moved first, because 3 Gamma always moved first. Because 3 Gamma was constitutionally incapable of waiting. She crossed the enclosure floor in a rapid, skittering run and stopped 6 inches from the Emperor's knee and sniffed his hand with the entire face. Intensity that was her particular style. Then she made the sound Petra had come to think of as the U-Pass initial inspection sound and sat down. 3 Beta followed, more slowly. She approached from the side, in the oblique line that was her preferred approach vector, and settled near 3 Gamma, watching her father with the measuring attention she brought to everything. 3 Alpha did not move from Petra's side for a long time. He watched his father with unblinking golden eyes, and Petra could feel the tension in him the way you could feel weather changing. Not a sign she could have named specifically, just a pressure she'd learned. She began to play the drum very softly. The low resonance moved through the enclosure, and she watched 3 Alpha's shoulders drop by perhaps 5 degrees, the subtle loosening of a creature that had been braced for something and had decided provisionally that it was not coming. He crossed the remaining distance in 2 unhurried strides and sat down between his father and Petra. In the space of one afternoon, in a hot box on a space station in the 7th system of the Veth Dominion. while a human nurse played a hand drum at the minimum clinical volume necessary to produce a calming resonant effect on hatchlings aged between 14 and 16 weeks post-emergence. An emperor sat on the floor with his children for the first time. Petra did not write about that part in the medical report. Some things were not for reports. She did write. 3 Alpha demonstrated successful transfer of tolerant behavior toward novel individual in the presence of established bond anchor. 3 Beta and 3 Gamma showed no regression in progress metrics. Session concluded nominally. She handed it to Moralic the next morning. He read it and looked at her. "This is the most minimal report you have ever submitted," he said. "Everything relevant to the medical protocol is in there," she said. He read it again. His throat sac went through a long, quiet color cycle. "Yes," he said, "it is." Weeks passed, then months. The rhythms of the nursery settled into something that felt, in the way that honest work always eventually did, like simply the shape of her days. Morning feeding, which 3 Alpha now conducted as a half-supervised, half-independent process. He had developed a clear preference for taking eggs directly from the tray rather than from her hand, which she had noted as a developmental independence marker, and which she privately thought was also him asserting that he was not in fact a baby anymore. 3 Beta's spine continued to improve. She had begun assigning the lateral stretches a specific playful name in her own head, the wing open stretch, because 3 Beta had started doing them on her own at random moments throughout the day, apparently having decided that they felt good. 3 Gamma had at some point become the most destructive enrichment object tester in the history of the Imperial Nursery, which Petra had flagged to the equipment suppliers as positive feedback on durability requirements. Moralic brought new staff members to observe the sessions. Junior attendants mostly, still in their training cycles, watching through the gallery window with their throat sacs cycling through the colors of professional anxiety. She was aware of being studied. She ignored it mostly, and when she couldn't ignore it, she used it. Asked the junior attendants what they observed, what they would have done differently, walked them through her thinking on the thermal imprinting hypothesis, and the behavioral observation that had preceded her first entry into the enclosure. "You observed them for 8 days before you entered," a junior attendant named Vrek said once, during a post-session debriefing. "Why 8 days? Why not less?" "Because I was scared," she said. The attendants looked at each other. "The documentation suggested the hatchlings were highly aggressive," she continued. "I knew the documentation was probably wrong, but I wanted to be confident enough in my observation of their actual behavior before I went in. So I watched until I was." She paused. "And because I knew that if I went in before I was ready, the hatchlings would know. They would see it in how I moved." She looked at Varek. "Fear communicates. If you're afraid of a scared creature, it knows. And then you're both afraid, and that doesn't end well for anyone." "How do you stop being afraid?" Vrek asked. "You don't stop," she said. "You know more, you plan better. And then you go in anyway." She thought about that answer that evening in her room, drinking coffee and watching the orbital ring. It was accurate as far as it went. It left out the part that was harder to explain, the specific quality of the work itself. The thing that happened in the enclosure when 3 Alpha pressed against her leg, the thing she felt when 3 Beta looked at her after a successful stretch with the expression she thought of as, "I did it," and which she suspected no xenobiological terminology quite covered. The thing that had made her a nurse in the first place, back on Earth, in a hospital in Bogota where her mother had taken her as a child and she had seen someone in a white uniform carry a frightened, crying infant down a corridor, and the infant had stopped crying, and she had thought, "I want to know how to do that." She still wanted to know how to do that. She was still learning. She would always be still learning. She was reviewing 3 Beta's latest spinal imaging when the emergency alert came through. It came on all channels simultaneously, the station's medical emergency system and the Imperial household notification both activating at once, which she had never seen happen before. She was out of her room and moving before she had consciously processed the text of the alert. The text said, 3 Alpha, respiratory distress, enclosure ambient temperature fluctuation detected, condition escalating. She ran. The nursery ward was 3 levels up and a long corridor away, and she covered it in less time than she would have thought possible, arriving in the observation gallery to find Moralic and 4 junior attendants clustered at the window with the frozen, slightly desperate quality of people watching something go wrong that they do not know how to stop. Through the window, she could see 3 Alpha in the center of the enclosure, standing, his neck extended and his throat sac cycling rapidly through orange and deep red, not threat coloring but distress coloring. The patterning, the documentation associated with respiratory failure in hatchlings. He was breathing in shallow, rapid pulls. Beside him, 3 beta and 3 gamma were pressed against him on either side, an instinctive support posture. What happened, she said, already moving toward the ramp. Temperature regulation failure in the enclosure's eastern quadrant, Moralik said. The ambient dropped to 180 for approximately 12 minutes before we caught it. For a hatchling his size, the thermal shock. She was already on the ramp. Get me the thermal stabilizer, the pediatric respiratory kit, and an emergency nutrition pack. Send them down on the mechanical arm. Vasquez, now please. She descended into the enclosure. The heat was wrong. She could feel it immediately. The differential between the western quadrant's maintained temperature and the colder, denser air that had pooled in the east where the thermal failure had occurred. For her, as a human, the difference was trivial. For 3 Alpha, it had been like standing in a freezer. She crossed the enclosure floor at a controlled walk, not running, because 3 Beta and 3 Gamma were already stressed and a running human would not help, and reached 3 Alpha and put her hands on either side of his head. His eyes found hers immediately. The distress cycling in his throat sac slowed fractionally. I've got you, she said. She was aware that he did not understand human language. She said it anyway, the way she always said things to patients who did not understand her language, because the voice and the steadiness were real regardless of the words. She ran her hands along his neck and throat, feeling the temperature, colder than it should be, significantly, especially at the ventral surface where he'd been most exposed to the dropped air. She moved to his chest and assessed his breathing by feel, by the subtle movement of the muscles under her hands, and counted. Too fast, too shallow. The pattern of someone working harder than they should to pull in air that wasn't warm enough. The mechanical arm descended with the kit. She didn't look up. She opened the respiratory kit one-handed. By feel, she had opened this kit in training 100 times specifically so that she could do it by feel in the dark, and found the thermal pad by shape. She pressed it against 3 Alpha's ventral throat with both hands. He flinched, not away but in, pressing into the warmth of it, the specific involuntary lean of a cold thing toward heat. She held it steady. Behind him, 3 Beta made a sound she hadn't heard before. A long, low vibration that the documentation called an adult comfort vocalization, but which 3 Beta was using now at 11 weeks post-emergence, which was earlier than any timeline she'd seen documented, and she thought, she's trying to help her brother. She kept the thermal pad steady and counted 3 Alpha's breath rate and watched the distress coloring in his throat sac and thought, clearly and methodically, through the escalation protocol, the intervention options, the contingency sequence if his breathing didn't stabilize. It took 11 minutes, not long by some measures, long by others. His breath rate came down. The throat sac coloring shifted, not to dark, not to calm, but to the pale amber she'd started to think of as his thinking color. He was still leaning into the thermal pad. She held it in place. There you go, she said. There you go. 3 Gamma had climbed onto Petra's back at some point during the 11 minutes. She had not noticed until this moment. 3 Gamma was sitting on her shoulders with her forepaws gripping Petra's collar and her tail wrapped around Petra's neck, which was warm and slightly constricting and absolutely not in any clinical protocol she had ever read. She reached up with her free hand and put it on 3 Gamma's tail. 3 Gamma tightened her grip slightly and made a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a crackling fire. Moralik, she would later be told, had to sit down in the observation gallery. 3 Alpha was assessed as recovered within 20 minutes, his respiratory indicators back within normal range, his thermal profile restabilized. She stayed in the enclosure for another hour anyway, monitoring, sitting on the floor, letting 3 Gamma stay on her shoulders and 3 Beta lean against her left side, and 3 Alpha rest his head in her lap in a posture that was absolutely not in any clinical documentation, but which she was going to describe in her report as volitional postural proximity associated with elevated comfort requirements post-distress event, which was accurate and also insufficient. She submitted the incident report and her clinical notes. She ate dinner without tasting it. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of her cot, and her hands were, for the first time since she had walked down the ramp on day 1, shaking slightly, not from fear. From the specific aftermath of controlled adrenaline, the thing that happened when you had been steady for as long as you needed to be, and now it was over and your body was catching up. She let it happen. She made coffee. She sat with the orbital ring visible in her viewport and thought about 3 Alpha's eyes finding hers, that immediate finding, and the fractional slow of the distress cycling when they did. As if her being there was itself a kind of thermal stabilization, she thought, I did not know I was capable of being that to something. Then she thought, I suppose you never do until you're needed. She slept, and in the morning she went back to the enclosure, and 3 Alpha was waiting at the base of the ramp. The thermal incident report reached the Imperial household within hours of her submission and generated a response within the day. Not a bureaucratic response, not a formal acknowledgement, but a direct message from Varesh Salon's personal communications channel, addressed to Petra Vasquez specifically. The message said, I have been told what you did. I have been told that my son's distress was reduced by your presence alone, before any medical intervention. I have been told that my youngest climbed onto your back and stayed there for 50 minutes. A pause in the text that she thought was deliberate, a Veth rhetorical structure indicating reflection. I am asking you to tell me what you felt. She read this 3 times. Then she wrote back. I felt scared. Not of them. I was never really afraid of them. Not after the first day. I was afraid for 3 Alpha. Afraid I wouldn't be enough, wouldn't be fast enough, wouldn't know the right thing. That's the fear that doesn't go away in this work. It just becomes something you carry and do your job alongside. What I felt when he found me with his eyes, like something that had been searching stopped searching. I've only felt that a few times. It's the thing I became a nurse to feel. She sent it before she could edit it into something more clinical and regretted nothing. The Emperor's response came in the morning. It said, I understand. My children have an eye for the essential thing. In this, I believe, they have found it. The months that followed were the most quietly remarkable of her life. 3 Alpha began to participate in his own care, not the way a human child might participate, not with language or conscious choice, but in the way that creatures with intelligence and memory participate, which is by making it clear what they need and trusting that you will understand. He came to her when he was uncomfortable. He brought her things, once, memorably, a piece of the enrichment equipment that had malfunctioned, which she had interpreted as a complaint, and Moralic had interpreted as a gift, and which she suspected was both. He watched the door when she was late arriving, which she knew because Moralic had started sending her messages on the days she had administrative duties that said, with increasing resignation in the subtext, 3 Alpha is watching the door again. 3 Beta's spine continued to improve until it was no longer a spinal condition, but simply the particular curve of her particular body, which Petra had noted in the medical record as resolved, and which 3 Beta acknowledged by doing the wing open stretch more elaborately than ever, with what Petra was nearly certain was showmanship. 3 Gamma became progressively the most physically capable of the 3, faster, stronger, with the specific quality of controlled energy that Petra associated with very healthy things. She also became the most affectionate in the tactile way, the one who climbed on Petra and sat on her, and pushed against her hands and generally treated the presence of a human nurse as an opportunity for prolonged contact that the documentation had no category for. Petra documented it as positive social bonding behaviors, and otherwise stopped fighting it. She gave a lecture to the junior attendants at the 6-month mark. Moralic had asked her to, which was itself remarkable, a senior Veth attendant formally requesting instruction from a human nurse. She stood at the front of the observation gallery, with the enclosure visible through the window behind her, 3 Alpha and 3 Beta visible in the lower left corner doing something she had started thinking of as light wrestling, and said what she knew. She said, when you enter the space of a frightened creature, the question is not, how do I demonstrate dominance? Or, how do I demonstrate competence? The question is, how do I demonstrate that I am safe? Everything else follows from that. Competence helps. Knowledge helps. Having the right equipment and the right training and the right protocols helps. But none of it helps if the creature you're trying to help cannot tell from your basic presence that you mean them no harm, she said. Sitting down is not a technique. It is an acknowledgement. It says, I am not here to be above you. I am here to be with you. And most creatures she had ever worked with, human and Veth and otherwise, most creatures know the difference, even when they are too frightened to reach toward it. You have to come down far enough that the reaching is possible, she said. The documentation is useful. The documentation does not know everything. The gap between the documentation and the creature in front of you is where you actually work. Vrek, the junior attendant, who had asked her how you stopped being afraid, asked afterward, do you think a Veth attendant could do what you did? If they knew what you know now? She thought about this carefully. Yes, she said, if they sat down. Without the armor? Without the armor. That is, Vrek paused. That is a significant behavioral modification for a Veth attendant. To be in the presence of an imperial hatchling without the protective posture, without size differential authority. I know, she said. That's why it worked. Because it was unexpected. Because it said, I am not relying on being bigger than you. I am relying on being honest. She paused. The armor was a wall. I took it down. That's all. Vrek looked at the window. In the enclosure, 3 Alpha had stopped wrestling with 3 Beta and was looking up at the observation gallery. At her, specifically, the golden-eyed precise attention she knew the geometry of by heart. He knows you're here, Vrek said. Even from that distance, he always knows, she said. That's the point. On the day that the third clutch was formally assessed as thriving by the Imperial Medical Authority, a formal designation that triggered a series of ceremonial and administrative processes she was only dimly aware of, involving the Dominion's courts and its calendar and some complicated recording of lineage that was not her concern. She received a formal summons to the Imperial Hall. She went in her standard nursing uniform, because she did not own anything more formal and because she thought, not entirely jokingly, that it was appropriate. The Imperial Hall on Solon Prime was a vast warm space, warm by design, maintained at Veth preferred ambient, which meant that Petra was sweating lightly within minutes, but had stopped noticing the heat months ago. She stood in a receiving line of officials and senior medical staff, all significantly taller than her, and waited. Varish Salan moved through the formal proceedings with the same deliberate stillness she had observed in every interaction. The quality of something that knows it has time, has always had time, will continue to have time, and has therefore decided to use it carefully. When he reached her in the line, he stopped. Petra Vasquez, he said. Your Radiance, she said. My son asked for you this morning, he said. Before the formal assessment, before the ceremony, he was waiting at the base of the ramp. She kept her face neutral, which took some effort. He will continue to require specialized care as he grows, the Emperor said. His siblings also. The thermal imprinting bond you have established is biologically significant and, I am told, essentially permanent. A pause. I am asking whether you wish to remain. She looked at him. I am a medical officer on assignment, Your Radiance. My reassignment is at the discretion of. I am the Dominion, he said without inflection. I am asking whether you wish to remain. She thought about the Niku in Bogota a long time ago. A woman in a white uniform carrying a frightened thing down a corridor, and the frightened thing going quiet, and a small child watching from a doorway thinking, I want to know how to do that. She thought about 3 Alpha's eyes, finding hers in the distress of the thermal incident, the immediate finding, like something that had been searching, stopped searching. Yes, she said, I want to stay. He looked at her for a moment with the complete, unhurried attention she had come to know. Then he said, good. Behind her, she was aware she would later be told that Moralic had made the depressurization sound, the one she thought of as a sigh, with considerable feeling. She walked back through the Imperial Hall and out into the corridor and took the station lift down 3 levels to the nursery ward and walked down the familiar corridor and through the observation gallery door and down the ramp, which was warm, and into the enclosure, which was warm and right, and 3 Alpha was in his usual spot and he pressed against her leg, and 3 Beta was doing her stretch, and 3 Gamma climbed onto her back. Before she had fully sat down, she put her hand on 3 Gamma's tail. She watched 3 Beta's spine move cleanly through the arc of the stretch. She had one job, she was very good at it. She sat on the floor and stayed. She had been on Solon Prime for 8 months when the first diplomatic incident happened. It was not technically her incident. She was present for it, which was different. The incident involved a human trade delegation, 6 people from the Economic Integration Office, arriving on the station for a quarterly review of the Accords, and 3 Alpha, who had by this point grown to approximately 90 centimeters and developed opinions. The delegation arrived at the nursery ward because one of the delegates had a note in their file indicating a personal interest in Dominion biology, which had been interpreted somewhere in the administrative chain as a request for a tour. Moralic had approved the tour. Petra had not been consulted. She found out about it when she arrived at the observation gallery and found 6 humans she didn't know standing at the window and 3 Alpha standing directly below the observation window with his throat, cycling a color she had only seen once before, during the thermal incident in which the documentation described as extreme threat response. She moved through the delegation without making eye contact with any of them, went to the ramp, and walked down into the enclosure. 3 Alpha's glow cut off the moment she came into his line of sight. He crossed to her in 3 strides, pressed against her leg, and stood facing the window with his eyes fixed on the delegates above, and his posture that of something placing itself between a threat and a protected thing. She put her hand on his dorsal ridge. She said nothing. She stood there, his warmth against her leg, and let him know without words that she had seen the situation and she was here and he could stand down. His glow did not return. Gradually, over several minutes, his posture shifted from full alert to attentive but resting, and he turned his head and looked up at her, and she looked back at him, and she thought, "You told them, didn't you? You saw strangers at the window, and you put yourself between your sisters and the window, because that's what you do." She had not known until this moment that he had started doing that. She filed it away as a developmental milestone and later in her report described it as emerging protective behavior consistent with imperial bloodline temperament indicators. What she did not write was, "I was proud of him." Later upstairs she explained to the delegation head, a tall, composed man named Heiress who had the careful manner of someone accustomed to diplomatic situations, that the hatchlings had a limited tolerance for large groups of unfamiliar humans and that future visits should be coordinated with her directly and should involve no more than one or two individuals at a time with prior behavioral preparation and no sudden movements near the observation glass. Heiress looked at her with the expression of a diplomat encountering a bureaucratic structure he hadn't expected. The tour was approved by Senior Attendant Mralik. "I know, and in the future, he'll route nursery visit requests through me first." She paused. "That's not a suggestion. 3 Alpha is 8 months post-emergence and the size of a large dog, and he can heat the ambient temperature of a room by 40 degrees in under 3 seconds. I would like to keep everyone safe, including your delegation." Heiress looked at her for a long moment. She had noticed that people did that a lot around her on this station, the long look that was not hostile but was recalibrating. She had stopped finding it uncomfortable. She had started finding it interesting. "How did you get him to stand down that fast?" he asked. She thought about this. "I've been coming every day for 8 months, she said. That's all. It was not all. But it was the part that was true in a way she could hand to someone else. Word got around in the station's human community, the way word always got around in small enclosed communities, by the particular osmosis of shared space and overlapping shift schedules and the commissary table at the 18th hour when the duty cycles aligned and everyone was tired and honest. She started getting looks from humans she didn't know. The maintenance crew who serviced the nursery ward's thermal regulators, the administrative staff who processed the medical reports, the other medical officers on the general wards. Not hostile looks, the opposite. The look that said, "We heard about you." The look that said, "The woman who sat on the floor." She had no idea how to feel about that. She drank her coffee and went back to work. Mralik, she had noticed over the months, had begun something she could only describe as mentorship, which she suspected he would have denied and possibly did not have a precise word for. He started bringing her into consultations on other cases, general veth pediatric cases, not nursery, where he wanted her read on behavioral indicators that the standard protocols weren't capturing. She gave her assessments carefully and with full acknowledgement of her limits. He translated nuance for her in cases where the patients were too young or too distressed for the translation tech to catch everything. He explained, without being asked, things about veth family structures and social hierarchies that she'd been reading about in the cultural archive and not quite grasping from the outside. Once she sent him a passage from an archival text about veth thermal family bonding that she couldn't parse at all. He wrote back with a clear explanation and then added at the end, "This is the same mechanism you established with the third clutch. You did it without the cultural knowledge. I have been thinking about that for some time." She wrote back, "How do you think it's possible to do it without the cultural knowledge?" His answer came the next morning and it said, "I believe you worked from a more fundamental level than culture. You worked from, what does a frightened thing need? The specific forms of veth thermal bonding are an elaboration of that root principle. You found the root before you understood the elaboration. This is not the usual direction." She read that twice. Then she thought about it for the rest of the day, which was a long day, because 3 Gamma had decided to deconstruct her enrichment course in a new and creative direction, and 3 Beta had her 6-month skeletal imaging scheduled, and 3 Alpha had spent most of the morning doing the thing she had started calling the long watch, where he positioned himself at the base of the ramp and looked at the observation window with the quality of concentrated attention that she had come to associate with him thinking about something. She had no idea what he thought about during the long watches. She had theories, but they were not medical theories. She kept them to herself. The 6-month skeletal imaging for 3 Beta came back cleaner than she had hoped when she had started the therapy program 4 months ago. The curvature was within normal deviation, not the dramatic straightening she might have written about in a success story, but the quiet, incremental resolution of a structural problem addressed consistently and early and correctly. She wrote it up as resolved in the medical record. Then she went back to the enclosure and told 3-beta directly, in the voice and the manner she used for all her patients, whether or not they could understand the words, that she had done well. 3-beta did the wing open stretch with what Petra had decided definitively was showmanship. The official integration audit came at the 10th month. A panel of Dominion Medical Authority officials reviewing the third clutch case as a model for future human-vet medical collaboration. Petra submitted her documentation, attended the formal session, answered questions for 4 hours in the measured and precise way. She always answered questions when she knew what she was talking about and cared about the outcome. The panel asked about methodology. She explained the thermal imprinting hypothesis, the behavioral observation protocol, the progressive bonding approach. They asked about the lack of protective equipment. She explained her reasoning. They asked about the risk calculus. She explained that too. One panel member, a senior official whose translated title was something like Director of Medical Standards, asked, "Do you believe your success with the third clutch was replicable by a vet practitioner?" She thought about Moralick's question and her answer to it, and Vreck's question and her answer to that. She thought about what it actually meant to sit down without armor in a room full of frightened creatures and decide that the risk you could not eliminate was worth the outcome you were trying to reach. "Yes," she said. "If they were willing to do what I did, the method isn't unique to humans. The willingness to take down the armor is." She paused. "That might be harder for vet practitioners to access, for structural and cultural reasons. But it's not impossible, it's a choice." The Director of Medical Standards looked at her for a long moment. "You are describing," he said slowly, "a methodology based primarily on the practitioner's willingness to appear vulnerable." "Not appear," she said, "be. There's a difference, and the creatures you're trying to help know it." She was asked to submit a formal methodology paper to the Dominion Medical Journal. She wrote it in 3 weeks with Moralick's review and titled it simply, "On the Use of Non-Armored, Floor-Level Contact in Imperial Hatchling Bonding Protocols, a Case Report." It was, she was told, 6 months after publication, the most downloaded paper from a human practitioner in the journal's history. She learned about this from Moralick, who brought it up with studied casualness during a post-session debriefing, and then went immediately back to discussing 3-beta's most recent growth indicators, which she respected greatly. On the day that the third clutch was formally designated mature enough for expanded environmental access, a Dominion milestone that meant they could now be taken to larger spaces, eventually to outdoor environments, beginning the long process of socialization with the wider Imperial Court. Petra sat on the floor of the enclosure for what might be the last session in this particular room, in this particular configuration, the 3 of them arranged around her in the pattern she knew better than any other geometry she had ever inhabited. 3 Alpha, as always, against her left leg. 3 Beta, as always, considering everything carefully before committing, currently lying across her feet. 3 Gamma, without question, on her back. She played the drum for a while, not for any clinical reason, just because she wanted to. The low resonance moved through the warm enclosure, and the hatchlings breathed around her. And outside the station, the stars of the 7th system of the Veth Dominion did what stars did, which was burn, without asking, without ceremony, simply as the basic condition of their existence, she thought. "I came here because no one else could think of a reason not to try," she thought. "I stayed because of this." She had one job. She had always had one job. The address changed. The species changed. The temperature of the room changed considerably, but the job was the same. Come in, sit down, be honest, don't go anywhere. She played the drum. She stayed. The expanded environmental access began on a morning that felt, to Petra, like any other morning. Coffee, notes, the walk down the familiar corridor, until she came around the corner to the nursery ward and found Moralick standing outside the enclosure entrance, with 3 new pieces of equipment and an expression she could not quite read. "Today," he said, "we begin the outdoor transition protocol." She looked at the equipment. A portable thermal monitoring array, 2 extended-range Medfield patches, and something she did not recognize, a flat disc of composite material about the size of a dinner plate, emitting a faint amber glow. "What is that?" "A thermal anchor," he said. "It broadcasts your registered heat signature on a low-frequency somatic channel. When the hatchlings are in an unfamiliar environment and become stressed, it will help them locate you at a distance." He paused. "The engineers developed it after the thermal incident. Based on your imprinting hypothesis," she looked at it. "They built me a homing beacon. That is a reductive characterization of a significant piece of xenobiological medical technology. Yes, she said, it is. She picked up the thermal anchor. It was warm in her hands, faintly humming, calibrated to something she could not hear, but that was apparently her.
No, thank you.
Tell the engineers thank you. The outdoor environment for the first session was a large thermal chamber on the station environmental simulation level, where the VETH maintained spaces calibrated to Solon Prime surface conditions for dignitaries during extended station assignments. The chamber was roughly the size of a small park. Open-air simulation, warm, dry heat, surfaces of heat-absorbing stone and composite material, the orange-gold light of Solon rendered through calibrated panels. She walked into the chamber with the thermal anchor clipped to her belt and stood in the middle of the space and waited. They brought the hatchlings in through a separate entrance, and she heard 3 gamma before she saw her, the rapid skittering of claws on stone, the sound of a creature encountering more space than it had previously encountered, and deciding immediately that this was excellent. 3 gamma came around a large stone formation at speed, skidded slightly on the smooth floor, found Petra with her eyes in approximately half a second, and then reversed course and went directly back to the stone formation to investigate it, having confirmed that the important anchor point was present and accounted for. Petra watched this with the specific warmth she had stopped trying to name. 3 Beta came in more carefully, as 3 Beta always did everything, pausing at the threshold and reading the space with the systematic attention she brought to novel environments. She was 90 centimeters now, her spine clean and strong under scales that had deepened from hatchling amber toward the first hints of adult copper. She crossed the chamber in the oblique approach line that was her signature, reading every surface, and settled beside Petra with the posture that said, I am deciding how I feel about this. 3 Alpha came last. He came through the entrance at a measured walk, stopped just inside the threshold, and did something she had not seen him do before. He raised his head and read the air with his sense slits, the whole front of his face working, and she understood he was reading for her, locating her in the space before he moved through it. He found her scent. Something in his posture settled. He walked across the chamber and pressed against her leg with the absolute assurance of something that knows exactly where home is. She put her hand on his dorsal ridge and looked at the space around them, the simulated warm sky overhead, the heat stone formations, 3 Gamma investigating everything at maximum speed, 3 Beta methodically cataloging her findings, and felt something she had no precise word for. Not happiness, though it was part of that. Not pride, though that was present too. Something more specific than either. The feeling of having been somewhere long enough to understand it, and of having that understanding matter in a real and ongoing way. She began to walk slowly deeper into the chamber. 3 Alpha walked with her, pressed against her left leg. 3 Beta, after a moment, fell in on her right. 3 Gamma circled them at a radius of about 10 meters, running her own investigation pattern, but curving back toward them at intervals, the orbit of something that wants to be away and close at the same time. She walked them to the center of the chamber, where the heat panels overhead were at their warmest, and sat down on the warm, dry stone. 3 Alpha against her left leg, 3 Beta across her feet. 3 Gamma circled twice more and then dropped to the floor at a distance of 3 meters, which for 3 Gamma was practically in her lap. She did not play the drum, she just sat. Rallick was in the observation booth above the chamber east wall. She could see him in her peripheral vision, not looking at his monitoring equipment, but at the floor of the chamber, at the small human woman and the 3 growing imperial hatchlings arranged around her on the warm stone, and his throat sac held a long, slow amber cycle that she had come to read as something close to contentment. She looked at 3 Alpha's profile, the increasingly complex scale patterning on his dorsal ridge, the secondary ridge that would eventually be the full imperial copper of his father. He was going to be large. All 3 of them were going to be large and healthy and well-adjusted, with full imperial temperament range and normal social bonding patterns and a capacity for trust that the documentation said should have taken 3 to 5 years and which had developed, for reasons that were still being studied in the journals, in 30 days. She thought, I did not do this. I came every morning and sat down. They did this. I just gave them a reason to believe it was safe to. 3 Alpha turned his head and looked at her. The golden eyes, precise and warm, with a slight tilt to the right that she had come to think of as the most recognizable expression in her life. She looked back. Neither of them moved for a long time. Outside the station, the system went about its business. Ships on approach vectors, orbital mechanics proceeding with indifference, the great machinery of 12 system governance grinding forward. None of it reached this room. This room was warm and quiet and had everything it needed. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the small hand drum. She had carried it every day since day one because it fit and because you never knew. She played the same rhythm she had played on day one, the resting breath tempo she had calculated from first principles because the documentation had not told her what to play and she had decided to try anyway. 3 Gamma raised her head, recognized the sound, and settled her chin back to the warm stone with the air of someone doing exactly what they wanted to be doing. 3 Beta's tail moved once, slowly. 3 Alpha's breathing, already slow, went slower. Petra played. The warm light fell from the panels above, and the stone held the heat the way old stone always did, steady and patient, and without demanding anything from it. She had come a very long way to sit here. She had crossed systems and submitted paperwork and survived a thermal incident and a diplomatic near-miss and the specific daily difficulty of doing careful and necessary work in a place that was not built for her, and she was here, and the thing she had come to do had been done and was continuing to be done, one morning at a time. A frightened thing, given enough time and enough consistency and a caretaker willing to come down to its level, stopped being frightened. Then it became itself. Then it became something that could go out into the larger world and be what it was, with all the fullness of what it was, because someone had been honest with it when it was small and scared. She had known this. She had known it since Bogota, since the white uniform and the corridor and the infant going quiet. She had just never known it at this scale before. Had never known that it translated across biology and atmosphere and star systems and the specific alien heat of a room built for something entirely other than her. It translated. It always translated. She played until 3 Gamma fell asleep on the warm stone, and then she played a little longer because she could, and because the morning was good, and because tomorrow she would come back and do it again. The drum was small in her hands. The room was warm. The hatchlings breathed. She stayed. She had been thinking for a while now about what to write home. Not about the station, not about the assignment. She had sent those messages, the factual ones, the ones that answered the questions her mother asked about food and safety and whether the Veth were as large as the documentary said. She meant something else. The message she had been composing in her head for months and not quite finishing. She started at the evening after the first outdoor session, sitting in her room with the viewport open on the orbital ring and her coffee cooling on the desk. She wrote, "Mom, I have been trying to figure out how to explain what this work is. And I think the problem is that every time I explain the details, the enclosure, the heat, the hatchlings, the Emperor coming to sit on the floor, it sounds either terrifying or extraordinary, and it is neither. Or it is both, but that is not what it feels like from the inside. From the inside, it feels like what I have always done. Come in every day, figure out what the frightened thing needs, provide it as consistently as possible, don't stop. That is the whole of it. I know you asked me what it is like to work for an alien empire, and I have been trying to find the answer that is true. Here is the truest I can get. It is exactly like every other place I have ever worked. The scared thing is scared in the same way. The work is the same work. The only difference is that the room is hotter." She stopped there and looked at what she had written. She thought about 3 Alpha pressing against her leg, 3 Beta's clean spine, 3 Gamma's tail around her neck in the worst moment of the thermal incident, holding on. She added, "I love this work. I think I always loved it. I did not always know that I loved it until I came here and found out that it was the same thing it had always been, even 9-star systems from home. That is either the most comforting thing I have ever discovered or the funniest. I cannot decide which. Maybe both." She sent the message before she could reconsider it. The reply from her mother came 3 days later, accounting for the relay delay, and it said, "Petra, I always knew you would go far. I did not think you would go quite that far. Are you eating enough? I have heard that the food on those stations is not always adequate for human nutritional needs. Also, I saw a documentary about the Veth, and they are very large. Please be careful." She read this and laughed alone in her room for longer than she had laughed at anything in months. Then she wrote back, "The food is fine, Mum. The coffee is excellent. The Veth are large, but they sit on the floor when you ask them to." She went to bed happy. The next morning she got up and drank her coffee and walked down the corridor to the nursery ward, which was the same corridor she had walked every morning for 9 months, and Moralic was there with his monitoring notes and his carefully suppressed reaction to everything, and through the observation window, the 3 of them were visible in their morning configurations. 3 Alpha watchful, 3 Beta already doing her stretch, 3 Gamma already investigating something at the absolute limit of what could reasonably be investigated. She went down the ramp. 3 Alpha came to the base of it. She sat down on the floor of the enclosure and he pressed against her leg, and she put her hand on his dorsal ridge and felt the slow warmth of it and thought, clearly and simply, with a specific certainty she trusted completely, this is where I am supposed to be. The warmth of the enclosure was all around her. The stars beyond the station's hull were very far away. The work was immediate and present and real. She stayed,